events in Genshin have naturally become something that many players complete primarily for the Primo Gems or the free weapon and character that usually come with the flagship event. For a lot of people, the story is secondary, and unless it's a flagship event, many don't pay attention to it at all. But there is something that has been niggling away at my brain over the last few years, particularly since Natlan released, that has made me believe that these events are doing a lot more than simply filling the gaps between major patches. I think Hoyoverse has been quietly using both flagship and smaller events to show what's happening behind the scenes as Teyvat prepares for what I believe will eventually become one massive final battle. I've said to friends for a long time that I think Genshin's ending is going to resemble something like Avengers Infinity War or Endgame, where every nation is forced to unite against a common enemy, whether that's the Heavenly Principles, the Abyss, or perhaps even both. If that's the direction the story is heading in, then it would make perfect sense for Hoyoverse to slowly build towards that ending in the background rather than suddenly announcing that every nation has formed an alliance overnight. And if you enjoy these deeper theory and lore breakdowns, I'd really appreciate you leaving a like. It genuinely helps support the channel and lets me know you'd like to see more videos like this, because once I started looking back through Genshin's events, I realized something that completely changed how I viewed them. Now, if we look at flagship events through Genshin's lifespan, they've often acted as vehicles, you could say, to tease future storylines. One of the clearest examples came during the Arataki Rocking Festival event in version 4.6. While obviously everybody remembers the festival itself, I think the conversation between Yaimiko and the Raiden Shogun at the end is arguably the most important part, and I think the one that most people remember vividly. Away from all the music and celebrations, the two discuss the growing inevitability of war, and Raiden A acknowledges that if conflict cannot be avoided, that she will fight, and Ye responds to that saying that when the time comes, everyone will stand beside her. At the time, of course, it was a crazy piece of dialogue, a very interesting piece of dialogue. And of course, now looking back on it and, seeing the events that happened subsequently in Natlan and Nordcry and everything in between, it feels much more deliberate. After all, this isn't the first time that Hoyoverse has planted huge pieces of foreshadowing inside events. The idea of the fake sky appeared first years before it, of course, became a major revelation, and then in the version 3.5 Windbloom Festival, we got our first proper introduction to the Hexen Circle long before they, of course, became central figures in the story. Even the Dragonspine events surrounding Albedo eventually laid the groundwork for later stories like Paralogism and Simulanka. So yes, the flagship events have always planted seeds for future stories, but if the only hint towards a coming war was one conversation back in version 4.6, I probably wouldn't have made this video. The reason I think this theory has weight is because it's not just the flagship events anymore. Even the smaller events have started showing nations preparing in ways that at first glance seem insignificant, but together paint a much larger picture. Take the most recent event in version 6.7, or Luna 8 if you want to call it that, the final long-range sightlines. This story follows Chaska and Chevreuse alongside members of the Knights of Favonius, in particular Hedwig from the Knights of Favonius, as warriors from across Teyvat exchange techniques, tactics, and combat experience. More importantly, the Flowerfeather clan, the Knights of Favonius, and Fontaine's Maison Gardiennage all come together for a joint training exercises. That is three nations. Three nations from completely different corners of Teyvat, conducting military drills together, improving communication, and refining their ability to fight alongside one another. That's not really something we saw in like the first or second year of Genshin. And in fact, I would say that Natlan is where it really started becoming obvious. This trend started to really develop around that time. The Archon quest itself, of course, revolved around war. Natlan's entire culture revolves around preparing its people to fight the Abyss, with every tribe playing a role in defending the Night Kingdom. Strength, cooperation, and readiness aren't just themes of the story, they're the foundation of the nation itself when we go there. Then, during the height of Natlan's conflict with the Abyss, during version 5.2, we got Exercise Surging Storm, a military wargame held in Mondstadt. maybe that's just a coincidence. But when I started noticing more and more events centered around combat preparation and the timing of it all, I went back through previous versions to see if this had been quietly happening for far longer than I or you may have realized, and it turns out it had. Recurring events like the Rolling Crossfire and Phase Trials may seem like simple combat events on the surface, but their stories often revolve around researchers developing better weapons, potions, and combat techniques to improve humanity's chances against increasingly dangerous monsters. We've also repeatedly seen researchers continue experimenting with fungi, beast taming, and other creatures through characters like Hania, and of course, everyone's favorite fungi companion, Bongohead. These aren't isolated experiments anymore. In fact, I would say it's the opposite. They're recurring research projects, recurring events that continue to evolve and change the way we perceive how and the direction of these, missions, you could say, and projects are evolving over time. And then, of course, there is the mutual security enhancing simulation in version 4.7. I would say that this is really one of the biggest pieces of evidence in this entire theory, in my opinion. The Millith organized a joint wargame exercise involving the Knights of Favonius from Mondstadt, Fontaine's Maison Gardiennage, the Shogunate Samurai from Inazuma, and Sumeru's Corso 30. The objective wasn't simply just to defeat monsters. Of course, that's too simple, right? It was improving cooperation between nations. Throughout the event, they analyze the battlefield tactics, they create increasingly complex combat scenarios, and they even mention at the end of it all that they're producing specialized training manuals based on each nation's strengths so that soldiers of every rank and every specialization can learn from one another. That isn't just military training, that's nations actively preparing to fight together. Of course, I would say that Hoyoverse's preparation for this final fight, this inevitability of a war, isn't just limited to military exercises, I would say. In my opinion, they've also been spending years preparing the political, the diplomatic side of things, as well as just introducing characters with one another, signature characters with one another, right? Before we got to, the likes of Sumeru and 3.0, if you go back even further, actually, let's go back to version 1.1, right? Unreconciled Stars introduced Scaramouche for the first time, while also planting the very first hints that the sky above Teyvat might be fake. Of course, that was a mystery that became one of the biggest revelations in the game's lore, and now is a critical plot point, of course, going forward with the Heavenly Principles and generally with the dragons as well, right? If we look back at right before Sumeru, you could see a new trend starting to occur, right? Around the time of version 2.6, characters started to travel between nations far more frequently than what they used to. Older events used to generally stay within the nation, and even during 3.0 and 4.0, there were some events that were still self-contained within the nation itself. Mondstadt characters stayed in Mondstadt, Liyue stayed in Liyue, and so on. However, it started to slowly decrease as time went on, with more and more characters appearing in, say, for example, in the Windbloom Festival, we could see characters from Sumeru appearing. And if you go into Fontaine, you could see characters from Inazuma coming, right? Take the Irodori Festival in version 2.6, right? Beyond simply celebrating Inazuma's reopening, right, of course, to the world, right, because this was after the events of the Archon Quest in version 2.1 and 2.2, and Inazuma was finally opening itself to the world. You could see that the event welcomed guests from Mondstadt and Liyue following the end of the Sakoku Decree. Trade resumed, foreign delegations returned, and characters who would have never previously met were suddenly interacting with one another. Then you obviously have roses and muskets in version 4.2, I think it was, of course, or 4.3, sorry, 4.3, of course, in Fontaine. You had characters from Inazuma, which is crazy to say, you wouldn't have thought about that during the Inazuma Archon Quest, but now characters from Inazuma traveled all the way to Fontaine for its film festival, with Ayaka being portrayed in the film, and then you had Ayato in the background dealing with political matters behind the scenes. It was a very small detail, at the time, but it was one that reinforces how these events are increasingly involving some form of diplomacy, negotiations, and strengthening relations between nations. The festivals themselves almost become an excuse to bring leaders, merchants, artists, and warriors together. Each individual event doesn't necessarily scream the nations are preparing for war, but when you put them together, a pattern begins to emerge. First, you had the lore, right? That was the big thing, right? Then you had the increased cultural exchange, trade reopened between nations, political relationships strengthened, characters began traveling freely across Teyvat, across multiple nations, to Nordkreis, to Inazuma, and you had military organizations starting to share tactics as well. Joint training exercises became increasingly common, and now entire nations are openly exchanging combat techniques while acknowledging that a great conflict may be unavoidable. Will Hoyo ever explicitly say that these events were building towards the final battle? Or in fact, I would say, will they ever explicitly say that a war is coming during these events rather than an Archon quest? Most likely not. I definitely don't think that's going to happen, actually, right? It's a very much like a 99% chance of it not happening. That's not been their style. If they want to show something now, they'll show it either in a Archon quest or like a major world quest, a la the moon gazing world quest. Instead, I would say that these events are used to plant small pieces of evidence over several years and allow players to, experience it and allow them to, think for themselves a little bit and connect them later on using that sort of, factor of, oh my God, all of these things linked it together. All of these things were, something that was developing towards something much more grander, something much more exciting, of course, right? Because obviously right now, like I said, if you go back to the very beginning, these events are right now just a mode for players to get primo gems, right? But what if for story players, for lore players, these events and the stories they contain become something bigger, something that actually allows them to connect to the Archon quest in some way, shape, or form? For me, that is exactly what's happening here. These events, in my opinion, aren't just filler between major patches anymore. They're showing us a world that's gradually becoming more connected, more cooperative, and more prepared than ever before. Because when the final battle eventually arrives, once again, whether it's against the Heavenly Principles, the Abyss, or potentially even something greater, it won't feel like we're getting 7 nations that are isolated all together, that never have met any time before this, right? It's something that's going to be feeling like, okay, this is something that we've worked towards, right? Something that we've helped develop over the last 6-7 years of this game's lifespan, right? It'll feel like something that has been quietly happening in the background all along. And if that's the case, then Hoyoverse may have already been setting up Genshin's endgame for years. We just didn't realize that the events were where so much of that groundwork was being laid.